Now, as you've probably already heard, there are rumors swirling about that the new live-action Star Wars show that begins filming later this year and will air sometime next year on Disney's new pay streaming service will take place 3 to 7 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, and will focus on the Mandalorians and how they deal with the fall of the Empire, the coming of the New Republic, and their place in the galaxy. And the reason I say rumors is because none of this has been officially confirmed by Lucasfilm. However, such a show makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that pretty much all Star Wars fans love Mandalorians and want more of them, especially in the new canon where they've really only been dealt with in the animated shows like Rebels and Clone Wars. And speaking of Clone Wars, it's interesting to note that Jon Favreau, who is writing and executive producing this show, actually voiced Pre Vizsla in the Clone Wars, who of course was the leader of Death Watch, a group of Mandalorians who firmly believed in their old warrior ways. So it only makes sense that someone who once played or voiced the Mandalorian would have developed an affinity or appreciation for them and now has the chance to, again, do something a lot of fans would be extremely excited about and something that he's probably excited about as well. That being focus an entire show around them and really develop their culture and their heritage in the new canon. And the level of political intrigue and action possible here could rival a show like Game of Thrones, though it obviously won't be anywhere near quite that, shall we say, adult in nature, considering Disney's new streaming service is being billed as family-friendly. That being said though, I do still expect this to be aimed at a slightly older audience while remaining accessible to the younger crowd, especially that younger crowd that may have come of age or started to come of age while watching Rebels. And having this new show be about Mandalorians, which again were explored to a good degree in Rebels, not to mention one of the main characters, Sabine was a Mandalorian, it makes sense to create something that would appeal to those who may have been introduced to Star Wars through Rebels and are now ready for a slightly more adult-oriented show. So carrying on the story of the Mandalorians and what becomes of them once free of Imperial rule seems like a logical place to go to keep them hooked on Star Wars, especially considering you could easily bring in a character from that show, and I'm of course talking about Sabine Wren, to either be one of the stars of the show or just a recurring character. And yes, if you're wondering, Tia Sakar, who voiced Sabine in Rebels, has also done live-action shows and movies, which means the possibility of her being a part of the show is not only there, but it'd be a shame if they didn't make it happen, even if it was just for a cameo or a small role. And honestly here, I think perhaps the most intriguing way to kick off this show, especially for fans of Rebels, is if it started with Sabine returning from her search with Ahsoka to find Ezra, and she comes back to find Mandalore is in a complete state of chaos and maybe in the midst of a civil war. And when she is inevitably asked where she has been for the last several years, she can give us hints about what has become of Ezra and maybe where Ahsoka is as well. But more importantly perhaps for the show, she could begin to tell us about other threats she discovered while venturing through the unknown regions, threats that both the new Thrawn novels have not only alluded to, but began to show us, and that the Mandalorians need to be strong in order to survive these coming threats. And speaking of characters that could be brought back, I think Katie Sackhoff could be brought in to play the live-action version of Baal Catan, who she voice-acted in both the Clone Wars and Rebels, though they'd no doubt have to age her a bit with makeup considering how old Baal Catan would be at this time. And yes, she has extensive acting experience, having played Starbuck in Battlestar Galactica, among other roles. In fact, I'd be stunned if she's not a part of this show, considering she and Jon Favreau very much worked together in the Clone Wars. Not to mention Baal Catan, last we saw her in Rebels anyway, is in possession of the Darksaber, making her essentially the leader of Mandalore, or at least those not loyal to the Empire. And though I suppose she could have been killed in the time between Rebels and when this new show will take place, and that might even be one of the central conflicts of the show, I don't know why you would do such a thing, especially when you further factor in we're going to see Baal Catan in Season 7 of the Clone Wars, also set to air on the same Disney streaming service. So it really only makes sense to bring her in and make her a part of the show and really begin to tie these things together. And honestly here, I think a show about Mandalore was about the best choice Lucasfilm could have made. Sure, I think a lot of fans would have preferred the Old Republic, and I do think we'll get to that time period eventually, no doubt. But Mandalore is the next best thing here. And again, as I've laid out, you can use a few existing characters, actors, and tie it into ongoing storylines to lure people in who were fans of those other shows who might not otherwise be inclined to throw down the money for yet another streaming service. And speaking of money, this show is rumored to have about a $100 million budget for its first 10-episode season, which puts it at one of the highest costing production shows ever, though still pales in comparison to the rumored $1 billion Amazon is supposedly pouring into the new Lord of the Rings series that will be on their streaming service. But that is another story for another time, perhaps. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Are you happy about getting a show about Mandalore, set a few years after the events of Return of the Jedi? Or would you have preferred something else, like the Old Republic, or maybe something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.